Okay. Let's see if I am live. I believe I am. Okay. So this is going on to my personal channel and I'll post it in the community tab, but this is a way for me to kind of talk through my writing process in a public way. But in the end, the intent here is that I can kind of create an internet time capsule, look back at how I was thinking about writing today, now in early 2018, and maybe compare that sometime in the future, because I've come to love writing as I've gotten deeper into content creation, and I hope to continue writing until I'm no longer able to write. On that note, I should preface by saying that I'm going to be giving tips and sharing ways that I go about researching and composing and telling stories on YouTube, because this is a wonderful platform in which to tell stories. However, I do not claim to be an authoritative model on how to write. I don't even claim to be a particularly good writer. I only claim to be a writer who is continually trying to improve and who is dedicated to imparting information by telling stories. On that note, if you are a content creator, especially if you're a new content creator, I hope that I have some value to offer you. And if you're an audience member of mine and just enjoy my content, I think that this will give you an insight into kind of how I think about creating things and how I go about the writing process. Because, you know, when you see a finished product of any type of work, whether it be artistic or academic or athletic, I mean, really anything, there's a great there's this mistake that a lot of people make of underestimating the amount of work that goes into it. And that can happen on the creation side as well, of underestimating how long it's going to take to write 100 words or 500 words or 1,000 words. And then it takes a lot longer. And that happens when you're observing someone's work as well. So this is what I wanted to talk about. First, I should just say that I know that I've come a long way, but I have a long way yet to go. I started off on YouTube creating garbage, just absolute garbage. Punditry, just kind of talking to the camera about my opinions about things. And then I started to develop scripts because I thought developing a script might help me get a larger audience. And to a certain extent it did, but we're talking about, you know, dozens and hundreds of views. Nothing special, right? And I was creating things like a top 10 list about, I don't know what, like issues progressives had with Hillary Clinton. And I would literally intersplice that with clips of me making a sandwich. And I know that sounds like insane, but I actually wrote something like that once. I made a video with some buddies where we revived the ghost of Eugene Debs so that we could explain the policy positions of Bernie Sanders. I did that as well. I did a video where I impersonated El Chapo, the drug cartel, put on a mustache and spoke Spanish, trying to impart information in a very non-traditional and just cringy way. Just cringe. Okay, and I've gone from cringe content to a couple years ago creating just general, relatively informative, but not the best produced content, to now, I guess you classify my writing and my content as semi-professional. I don't do this for a full-time living, but I would say the project is relatively sustainable. It's definitely worth the time in a creative sense, and it's helping me get things like interviews while I'm here in DC. I recently had an interview with a big media company. I've had a couple interviews this semester, and I know part of it's because right there at the top of my resume is my YouTube channel and what I can do to the best of my abilities, how I can tell a story and inform people. So enough of that. Let's talk about how most of us get into writing. Most of us get into writing through school. I mean, I think I wrote a comic when I was a kid, but the kind of formal writing that I did started in middle school, going into high school, preparing for standardized testing, and then going into college. And the kind of writing you do in high school and college, number one, it's forced, right? It's a means to an end, and that end is just getting by in class. If you're an overachiever, which I was not, you know that your end might be, you know, to get into a good school. But my end was just to survive, and my end was just to do as little work as possible and get it done. Nonetheless, I could tell at the time that I was decent at writing. I could compose thoughts. I could write satire particularly well. I remember we were preparing for a standardized test, and our teachers gave us the topic of write about someone who influenced you, and I wrote this satirical piece about how Bob Barker was the largest role model of my life. And I remember my teacher actually read it in front of the class. But again, this was not quality writing. This was not true storytelling. This was just sarcastic teenager writing. But at a certain point, you know, after my undergrad and moving into YouTube, I wanted to come back to grad school. And so now I do a lot of academic writing as well. And that kind of writing requires a couple different things. Academic writing requires a lot of research, a lot of structure, and a lot of citation. That complements well to my YouTube writing, which is creative nonfiction at this point, which involves citing sources, having the information handy, but at the same time trying to tell a story. And I will tell you that the turning point in my writing for YouTube was my Berlin Wall video, when I decided I'm not just going to explain, I'm going to tell a narrative. I'm not going to worry about condensing a YouTube video into 5 minutes arbitrarily. I'm going to take as long as it takes to tell this story, and I'm going to do it in the only way I knew how at that point, which was just kind of to start writing and just see where the writing led me. And that worked really well, and it got me onto the path of looking at 3-act story structure. So that would be the first tip I would give you, is to take a look at 3-act story structure. That's not to say that every time you write something, either creative or nonfiction, creative fiction or creative nonfiction, that you need to have a very formulaic 3-act structure, but just understanding the anatomy of what a story can be. In fact, I think there's a book called The Anatomy of Story. Knowing about, you know, how a character is developed, goes on a journey, and changes in some way to tell a story is a very, very powerful way, and something that it taps into something deep in the human psyche about what they want. The human psyche craves stories and story structures and characters and growth. The human psyche does not crave synopsis and explanations necessarily. Those things can be good. Those things can be creative. Plenty of people are doing it, but that's just not what worked for me in the past, and so I had to change. Like I say a million times, I'm so grateful to my audience because you forced me to be better and to reconsider my creative processes. So the next tip I would give you is to not just repeat, don't just practice for the sake of practice, but have deliberate practice. So a lot of self-help gurus and inspirational people will say, just do it. Just, you know, go out there and repeat and do something 100 times and you will get better. And there is a lick of truth to that, but not unless you're being, I think, deliberate about your practice, thinking about what skills you want to develop. Now, if you're a YouTube creator, there's a lot of skills that you might develop at any given time, from production to filming, camera work, audio, your writing. So I want to focus on the writing a little bit. And the biggest tip I can give you beyond looking at story structure is to look at content that you already consume and enjoy and reverse engineer it. Why do I enjoy the stories that I'm consuming? And that can be, if you're creating news content, that can be by looking at other news creators. I certainly do that. If you're in history, looking at the best historical podcasters or YouTubers that you know, the people that are telling stories and being engaging and entertaining you, and thinking about why. But if you really want to supercharge this tip, go look at content that has absolutely nothing to do with the content you're creating. So for example, I have looked at Doctor Who episodes that I thought were particularly well written and thought, how can I apply this to my YouTube videos about Russia or Germany? Right? Completely unrelated topics. I'm just looking for the structure and the character development though. I've looked at things like Quentin Tarantino movies, who's one of my favorite directors. I've looked at Peter Jackson films. One of my favorite films is The Fellowship of the Ring. And so I looked directly at, for example, there's a scene where right after Bilbo disappears at the party, at the firework party in the Shire. And he and Gandalf are talking in Bilbo's house. Or maybe it's Frodo and Gandalf are talking. Wow, this is a great explanation. Wonderful job, Will. But essentially, there's just layers upon layers of drama, right? There's the drama of the ring. There's the drama of the night of the party and Bilbo leaving. There's the drama of Samwise Gamgee hiding in the bushes, and the drama of the ring wraithers starting to come. And so you can imagine how that might apply to nonfiction, right? You're not just talking about how there was a revolution in Russia. You're layering on the drama so that you can tell a better story, whether it be about history or news. Looking at fiction if you're a nonfiction writer, or looking at nonfiction if you're a fiction writer, can help you kind of start to balance those skill sets. If you are a reader of historical novels, the ones that I particularly enjoy as a reader are the ones that have some sort of a narrative and are not just the historian rambling on about every source they could possibly get their hands on. So be a big consumer of media. Be a big consumer of media that's outside of the genre you're creating, and take a look at 3-act story structure, and just think about character, think about creating a narrative that you can flow into, a starting and an end point, and a piece of growth. One last thing about character is that a character doesn't have to just be a person. Some of my best characters have been cities or groups of people. Protagonists can be societies or abstract concepts, like, for example, a recent video, my protagonist was the idea of world government. That was my protagonist. And so that's a rather bizarre protagonist if you're thinking about it in literal terms as character being someone like Luke Skywalker or Frodo Baggins. So think outside the box and take a look at some other genres and some other people that are creating stories. The next thing that I would recommend, something that has taken my writing and my storytelling to another level, is to go deeper. Now, let's go deeper with this topic, of course, is the thing I say in all my videos, and I do that for a reason, and it's because I think it was a conversation I was having with Tristan over at Step Back History when we were just chatting about what the direction of our channels were, and Tristan, I think it was him, said something to the extent of, like, there's just a voracious appetite out there for people that kind of go beyond the news and just and don't just give you surface level pyramid style stories like you would get in any typical newspaper or any typical news broadcast, but really just diving into the information for people who are junkies and who just crave more. And so let me give you an example of something I did poorly in the past that can be illustrative into what might be better going forward. A couple years ago, I made content that one of them was explaining the Electoral College to people who didn't know what it was, and one of them was explaining the concept of superdelegates in the Democratic primaries to people who didn't know what that was. That is not an example of content that I think is very viable on YouTube or on any platform, really. Because think about the person that would watch a video about, politics explained for non-political thinking people. I mean, that might get shared by Facebook moms or something, or, freedomeagle.facebook.net or whatever the hell. But the person who clicks on a video about the Electoral College, no matter how much you dumb it down, no matter how much you condescend, is nonetheless probably going to be someone who already knows what the Electoral College is and has an opinion on it. The same thing with superdelegates in the Democratic primary. It's an even better example. Nobody is going to click on a video about superdelegates who doesn't already at least have an idea of what superdelegates are. That's just the reality of the situation. That's just the reality, I think, of how content works. And so therefore, the goal should not be to bring in a wide audience to things like the Electoral College and superdelegates that are kind of for junkies anyway, but rather to take someone who's already a junkie and give them even more information, right? Think about, in my case, I was a news junkie. I already knew what these things were. And so the content that I would consume is something that deep dives into those topics even more than I already know. And changing that paradigm of I'm going to bring in people who don't care and make them care to I'm going to bring in people who already care and make them care even more and teach them something new that they never even would have considered. It's going to give them such incredible context. That was the paradigm shift that helped me to really frame my writing in a better way. So I would highly recommend, when somebody tells you to create content you would enjoy, really consider that carefully, right? Is it something that interests you and you're just kind of giving surface level knowledge, or are you really adding to the conversation? That's something I'm going to bring back here in a little bit, is making sure you're adding to the conversation when you're creating content. Here's another thing when you're writing specifically for YouTube and for video content, is you can let the writing be a little bit complicated if, and this is a big if you can use imagery on screen that clarifies what you're talking about, that kind of takes the pressure off you to get into the minutia in the writing. Let me give you an example. Is I took in my Russian Revolution video, I was talking about Caesaro papism. which is the idea that the Tsar is both the head, the Tsar of Russia is both the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the head of the state, and so he gets this Caesar and Pope, right? It's this complicated term, but I was able, and if you ever see me use 3 panels in a video, it's usually because I'm explaining something I believe to be complicated, right? And I use 3 panels, a little cartoon character, a cartoon character with like a divine inspirational beam of light, a cartoon character with a crown, and a cartoon character with, I don't remember how, but basically I animated something in a way that created clarity for what was probably too dense for writing alone. So if I was writing a blog and I left the text as it was, I think people would probably get confused. But as it was a video and I was able to utilize imagery to explain my point, I didn't have to worry so much about losing people because I was showing them, and this is a weird conflation of show and tell. I was showing and telling them at the exact same time, and that helped. I think that helps when you're trying to talk about dense topics to remain brief and utilize brevity, not go on and on and on. But at the same time, you know, whatever. Lost my train of thought there. Let's see what else. Oh, when it comes to your writing, I would say, especially since YouTube is a personal platform, it's a social platform, you're talking to your audience and you're kind of going into it with the idea that they're going to talk back to you in the form of comments or with interactions on the platform, that you should be using the word you a lot in your scripts. You should be talking directly to your audience, and that means sometimes you're going to want to use conversational terms. You're going to want to keep it light and not get too intense on vocabulary. That being said, don't treat your audience like babies. You can use SAT words and GRE words or whatever. You can use complicated vocabulary. You don't have to treat your audience like idiots, but you can be conversation with them at the same time, if that makes sense. So you could have a video, in theory, in which the word dude and the word quixotic appears in a script, right? Anti-disestablishmentarianism, dude. Theoretically, it's possible. What I'm saying is be personal with the audience, be conversational. This is YouTube after all. But don't, again, going back to the idea of like, don't just give surface level stuff to bring in people who don't really care that much. You're talking to an audience theoretically that's already informed on something. And so it makes sense to use some more complicated vocabulary in the right context. On that note, I wanted to move into a little bit about sourcing, because for me, as someone who's working on a master's degree and does a lot of sourcing, and who for the last few years have been writing educational content on YouTube, I find the state of sourcing on YouTube to be an absolute disaster. And that includes a lot of the biggest channels, multi-million subscriber educational channels, hundreds of thousand subscriber educational channels, all the way from the bottom to the top. There is just a plague of people just not bothering to cite their sources. Or if they do, they just cite a book, right? And they don't cite their sources appropriately. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I use APA in my video with like little parenthetical citations at the bottom. However, if you read my subtitles, you will actually find quite often informal parenthetical citations of where information came from. Now, this is useful because if somebody asks, where did you get that fact? You can tell them even if you wrote the script 3 years ago. But second of all, it's the ethical thing to do. The complicated thing about YouTube is that there's no academic, like, honesty policy on YouTube, right? You can plagiarize if you want, I think. I don't think there's anything in the, you know, the community guidelines that says don't plagiarize. But it's just incredibly bad form, right? There's no formal complication like there would be at a university when you plagiarize where you'll get expelled. At worst, you might, you know, have the community come after you, but nonetheless, you shouldn't be plagiarizing, okay? I try my very best to plagiarize. I try my very best to cite my sources as best I can. I keep a record of my internet sources. I keep a record of my book sources, and generally speaking, of the page numbers of the information I found. And since maybe the beginning of last year, I've really tried to create a diversity of sourcing, like not just one book about one person, but 3 or 4 books about a person, to get a diversity of opinions and sourcing from multiple authors and multiple experts and multiple internet sources and academic sources. I try to vary it up as best I can. And that's just good form in general, but it's going to make your writing better as well. Let me give you an example of something I think I didn't do particularly well and how I'm working to improve that. So I made a video last year, beginning of last year, about Andrew Jackson, and I used a book that I absolutely adore, American Lion by John Meacham. Now, there were lots of sources I used for that video, but I leaned on John Meacham's books to the point where I felt like at times I was probably leaning on to the point where I was usurping the thesis a little bit, right? And nobody ever brought this up to me, but it's just something that I noticed in my own introspection later on. And so what I did going from there is I tried then to bring in multiple book sources on the same topic. I think I pushed that in the other direction to an extreme when I made my video about MLK and the March on Washington, where I was using so many book sources that it got to the point where the video was just boring because I was just quoting so many authors and using such a variety of sources that it was just like weighing down the script and dragging the whole thing out. So I've gone from one end of the spectrum of kind of leaning on one particular source too much to now, sometimes leaning on so many sources that it takes out the flow. It's about striking a balance, and it's about, quoting people at the right times when they've said something super interesting, citing your sources parenthetically, perhaps in your subtitles, or at the very least listing things in your description. Or what I do is I share things with my patrons once I've completed a video. And of course, upon request, if anybody ever needs a source from me, I'm willing to provide it. I'm not guaranteeing that I can always respond to those things, but I generally try to. Like I said, there is a plague on YouTube of people just not bothering to cite their sources, or even worse, I think, usurping, like synopsizing essentially a video, or I'm sorry, like giving a synopsis of a book, right? And then just saying at the end of the video, oh yeah, this is from a book. I took this author's, like I basically paraphrased this book of this author, and now you can go buy it, right? And it's almost as if you're justifying paraphrasing and stealing from an author by saying, well, I'm bringing you, I'm selling your books, so I'm bringing you revenue, get over it. I stole from you, but just, you'll deal with it. Or even worse, this is probably some of the most egregious thing, is just taking a chapter of a book, paraphrasing that as your video, and then just kind of sneaking it in the description. Oh yeah, this is from a book, chapter 1 of this book. That might not technically be illegal or anything on YouTube, but I happen to think it's highly unethical and just poor form. Be better. We should be striving to be better, to respect fellow creators, because let me tell you, if we think we work hard here on YouTube, which I think a lot of us do, the authors and the academics that write books about particular topics, that dig into archives and find facts and figures and create original research, they're working hard too, and they deserve credit for that work. So I should probably do a whole video on sourcing sometime, but that's my general gist of what I want to say about it. And on a related note, your videos should not be formatted like a Wikipedia page. And I mean, clearly Wikipedia should not be your main source. It can be a great starting point, but should not be your main source of information. If your video is like structured chronologically as a Wikipedia article, your educational content is subpar. And if your educational content about like a person or an event starts off with, we're going to talk today about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was born in blah 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 in California. If your biography of a person starts off with the year, the date, and the place where it happened, you are really falling behind in storytelling, okay? I can only say that as someone who's made that mistake before in my writing. Reconsider the purpose of your storytelling and your narrative structure if you are telling stories by starting off with the date and the place. It's probably not a sufficient narrative that you're providing to your audience. A couple more notes and some things that I want to improve on as a writer going forward in my semi-professional writing career at this point. One thing you should ask yourself when you're writing scripts is, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Who cares? If you are in journalism, oftentimes it's not sufficient to say, this is interesting, therefore we should broadcast or publish this story. If you're in a journalism outfit, you have to come up with a reason why it's relevant to your target audience. So if you're writing for a local newspaper and you want to talk about Brexit and you live in the USA, you're going to have to come up with a reason why Brexit is relevant to a local audience. And so it's important to think about, why is this important? Why does it matter? And if you're writing a YouTube video, of course, that can help you in developing a narrative structure. And it can help you in your writing, because you don't just end when the chronology of the story ends, right? Oh, the Bolsheviks took over Red Square in the Kremlin. The end, right? You'd say, oh, the Bolsheviks took over Red Square in the Kremlin, and therefore, you know, Lenin was in power, and then Stalin was in power, and millions of people died in World War II, and like just a whole array of events were set in motion. And now we have the modern world where there was a dichotomy between East and West, and even going for, like, you see where I'm going with this? You can create value for your audience by thinking about, why does this matter? You don't have to explicitly say, now I'm going to tell you why it matters. That's not necessary. But by just asking in your writing, you know, before you finish, if an audience member were to be asked, you know, what did you learn and why is it important? Could they tell you? Be original. Try to be original, either in facts or opinions. When you're writing for YouTube or you're writing for anything really, there is, again, a plague on the internet of just taking what other people have done and reformatting it to whatever you're doing, right? So, oh, I got a book. Oh, I'm going to animate it, right? Okay, nice. Good job. I guess that's not the worst thing in the world. But I think that you should be asking yourself when you create content, are you adding to the conversation, right? Let's talk about the example of journalism again. There are journalists who go out there and they gather original facts and original information. They have sourcing and they bring information to the table, and then they might give you some analysis on top, right? Based on based on the information they've acquired. And there are then opinionists. Sometimes I play this role myself, but sometimes there are people who just tell you their opinion on the information that other people have gathered, and then they call themselves journalists. And I guess maybe in like a broad definition they are, but there's a difference in value, and at least in my opinion, a subjective difference in value in creating original information and then giving analysis on top of that. That's not always possible, and it's tough in our content-driven world. Sometimes you just kind of want to give your opinion, and the only thing I would say is, if you're giving opinions, try to give original, you know, interpretations and not just be a parakeet. And that's something I've had to learn over the years and something I've had to get better at, but I think it's really, really important to try to bring something original and try to just add to the conversation. If you're adding the conversation, you're adding value to the world, you're bringing good things in the world, and you can feel good about yourself, right? It's not the highest bar in the world to meet, and you might sometimes miss it. I know I've missed it before and will probably miss it again, but it's a nice minimum standard to have. Add something good to the world, bring information, and cite your sources. Yeah. So, like I said, I am not saying that I'm the best writer in the world. I am not even saying I'm a particularly good writer, but I'm trying to improve. And so there's a couple things that I was thinking about today in terms of like, what would I like to improve for 2018? How would I like to improve my writing going forward? And if I were to watch this video in a couple years, you know, will I be able to determine, you know, did I do this or did I not? One of them is I want to vary the structure that I'm using in my videos. So it used to be I'd write, you know, introduce the topic, explain the topic in the video. Now I kind of go with a hook, right? And then I go chronologically, and then I bring back the hook at the end. And that, you know, that works. People love that shit. But it's also kind of making me into a one-trick pony, I think. And so you've seen in my last few uploads that I've tried to kind of manipulate the structure a little bit, try to tell some unique stories in some different ways. And I want to continue to try to do that. I want to try to employ brevity more often in terms of writing less but saying more. My videos tend to be long, and that means that there's a lot of space between uploads. I think that last year, you know, taking my time and considering the narrative was valuable because it helped me create better content that allowed me to grow. But now that I've kind of got a roll and I've got a better feel for the writing, I think it's time to kind of just, you know, reduce. You know, I can tell stories, I think, more comfortably with less words, if that makes sense. You know, a 5-minute video is not out of reach for me anymore. I just need to, you know, put my mind to being a little bit more careful and what's the word? Spendthrift with my paragraphs. On that same note, you know, sometimes I let scripts just never get finished. I've been in the process of writing a script about the fall of the German Republic for a very long time, and it's a struggle because it's such an important topic to me, and I want to get it right, that you kind of get into a paralysis about a couple pages in where you're like, I don't know where I'm going, and I don't know where I should be wanting to go. And so maybe not on that particular topic, but on other scripts, you know, a pencils down approach is valuable for your writing? How can I just go ahead and wrap it up? And you know, I've done my best, but if I sit here and stress out, it's not going to get that much better in time. So that, my friends, is the state of my writing and the tips that I would hand out at this point in my career in academia and on YouTube in 2018. It involves a lot of looking at storytelling and narrative and not just synopsis of the information that you're trying to share, considering character, citing your sources, and just trying to put something original in the world. If you follow some of those steps, you're going to be a lot better content creator. And I'd be happy to have a discussion with some of you about these topics. I hope it's provided you with a little insight into my content creation process, and specifically, of course, into my writing. So on that note, I'll see you later, guys.